Up next, we have Suzan Erem, the Executive Director and co-founder of the Sustainable Iowa Land Trust. The title of her talk today is Mapping Our Values to Our Landscape. What does Iowa's land use say about us? Suzan Erem is the Executive Director and co-founder of Sustainable Iowa Land Trust, graduated from the University of Iowa in the mid-'80s, and cut her activist teeth on the farm crisis of the 1980s, where she joined a much larger effort to organize family farmers. Returning to Iowa in 2010, she and her husband saw the result of that crisis and the new one in full force: massive monocrop commodity farms, hog barns, and just a few small farms left. Land had quadrupled in value, and no one but large landowners could afford to buy more. After 2 years of catching up with Iowa leaders and researching solutions, she helped organize the Sustainable Iowa Land Trust, which now permanently protects 935 acres across 9 farms in Iowa for natural, friendly table food farming. Let's give it up for Suzan Erem. Welcome.
Can we get up the Why Iowa rolling PowerPoint, please? Thank you. So everybody, first I want to thank Dave Murphy for this incredible organizing job he's done. It's pretty hard to get the kind of stars we have here in the room all in one place and one time. So thank you, Dave, for all your good work. There he is. And I want to thank Francis and George and Patty and Diane Rosenberg, you'll be hearing from, and John Eichert and Denise O'Brien and Jean Lloyd-Jones and a lot of other wonderful people upon whose shoulders I stand when I talk about farm issues. And anything I get wrong is my fault and not theirs. But I'm going to start with a story, a once upon a time story, about when Iowa's small towns thrived, when there were hardware stores and gas stations and lots of churches and lots of bars. And people liked to go downtown, and they ran into people they knew, and they would chat on the sidewalk even when it was 20 below. And the times when the schools in Iowa were the pride of the nation. Everyone knew that if you had an education from Iowa, that you were competent and qualified and could work anywhere. A time, for better or for worse, when we grew up and we grew old with all the same people all of our lives. And that provided a certain accountability to one another when we had to look each other in the eye at church or at the baseball game. We had our differences, we got past them because we knew there'd be a day when we needed each other for something. We helped out our neighbors just because we could, and because that's the way we were raised. We shared equipment, we shared harvest labor, we shared recipes, and we shared wisdom. Iowans were known for their sense of fairness. It was a state that elected Harkin and Grassley because that was the right thing to do. It was balanced. And we had a work ethic. And Iowans were never prideful, and they were always helpful. And I don't think it's coincidental that those were also the days when the first thing a farmer planted when he got his land was an orchard. I don't think it's coincidental that those were the days when our farms averaged 34 crops, or when Iowa was the #1 apple producer, or the #1 wine grape producer, or the #1 potato producer, and when the average farm was 160 acres, and what you owned was all you farmed. So what does our landscape say about our values now? We brag that we're #1 in corn, hogs, and eggs. We grow 25 million hogs for China and Japan while we get to keep the manure. It's a whole new meaning to Asian toilet. We have 23 million acres and 2 crops. You've heard all about that. We have fields full of 47-row planters and $300,000 and $400,000 combines. So much for not being prideful. Our so-called family farms are tens of thousands of acres, not properly accounted for because still the census tells us more about what we own compared to what we operate. And a lot of Iowa's farmland is operated, leased. Our small towns are dying. I invite you to go to Rockwell City and just cry while you stand on the courthouse steps. Our schools are closing, our air stinks, our water is poisoned, and the public is paying to fix it. And we're losing farmland at the fastest pace ever. In the next 20 years, we will face the largest land transfer in the history of the United States. And the same consolidation that everybody rails about here today is happening in land ownership. But where are our elected officials and where are our candidates on that issue? Frankie Francis said, wealth is accruing to wealth. Well, guess what? That's happening in land everywhere. And while our friendly Californian and our very nice Illinoisan Republican candidate both waxed eloquent about corporate ownership of land, in Iowa, we are actually one of the few states that has an anti-corporate farming law, and that's not so much the issue. Thank you. But that hasn't stopped family LLCs, which are excluded from that law, to growing to 10, 20, 30, 40,000 acres of ownership. And it's only going to get worse as we go on, and I have a solution for that at the end. But $180 billion of land will change hands in Iowa alone in the next 20 years. What values will our land reflect when those 20 years are up? This is Iowa on a rainy day. Nobody here farms like this. I know that because I know almost everybody here. And I'm thankful for that. But let's not delude ourselves. This is the majority of Iowa. John Whitaker would like to talk about no-till and cover crops, which he and I both know, because we both serve on the state technical committee, is a tiny little fraction, about 600 to 800,000 acres a year at any given time, on compared to 23 million of acres in crop production, after many, many years and millions of dollars spent by the USDA to convince farmers to use cover crops. But these are the values that we reflect. They may not be the values of the people in this room, but those are Iowa's values now. And they didn't just happen. These are not market forces. There is only one invisible hand here, and no one here has talked about it. And that's why I'm here. The invisible hand here is the hand of finance. And it is the financiers who thrive on land speculation. The very land speculation that our country was founded upon. So we will not place judgment upon it. We just must recognize that land speculation and the debt that it causes limits the choices of everyone involved. Every farmer, every landowner, everyone. And the decisions that our lawmakers and our farmers have made up until now have brought us to this. See the 2008 Farm Bill for the invisible hand of the market, because there you're going to see that even that recently, corn and bean farmers were penalized for growing anything but commodity crops if they received a subsidy. They lost their acres. They lost their basis if they planted any of those acres to fruits and vegetables. And that was a permanent decision that they made. A permanent investment to grow fruits and vegetables, which, by the way, the market had disappeared for. The local food infrastructure had disappeared. So there are policy decisions that have been made that have caused our landscape to look like an Asian toilet. But we are number one in one thing. We are the number one contributor to the dead zone in the Gulf. So today's farm crisis, I'll go over this quickly. I don't have to convince anyone here, but I do hope that we'll use the video and the live streaming that Dave has arranged for so that we can put pressure on our candidates all the way through November. Today's farm crisis is hunger. We are growing stuff that we can't eat, and we're exporting it. And I'm sorry, John Whitaker, I respect you immensely, but you are wrong. Our country is not food secure, and wherever you are getting that information is inaccurate. We are growing climate change between the methane and the cornfield microclimates and the fuel that we're growing and the carbon that we're throwing around. We are a big cause of climate change in this country and in this world, the way we're farming now. Today's farm crisis is economic disparity. It's big farms getting bigger while most can't even afford an acre. I told somebody here that our farms go for $10,000 an acre in the Northwest, and they said, what? Those are like California prices. Yes, we know that. Guess what? They are closer to Des Moines, but we'll get to that. National security, between trade wars and dependence on fossil fuels to distribute our food around the country. That alone, those two things alone are a serious, serious threat to our national security, but that's been covered. And public health. We are now 6th in the country for childhood obesity. We are raising our kids on corn syrup and soybean oil, and Iowa is a food desert. This picture is from Des Moines in 2018. Another reflection, as much as we don't want to know it, of our values here in Iowa. This is a national issue, and I think I went too far. No, we'll take that. Very few states in Iowa grow, or in the country grow most of their own food. Most of them do import between 80 and 90% of their food. And presidential candidates and federal policymakers are asleep at the switch. They are not paying attention to what we do every single day, eat. And I am really tired of the candidates coming through here and equating agriculture with the food that we sit down and eat at night. Okay? Let's stop letting them get away with that. I know it's a little late in the game, but let's talk about table food instead of just agriculture. And imagine here in Iowa, fresh, frozen, freeze-dried strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, all year round from farms right here that you could visit and take your kids to and not worry about. Imagine the chickens and turkeys and pork and lamb grown in fresh air on green grass with no antibiotics and no big stink. Imagine all the kinds of nuts and nut oils and milks coming from just outside your city limits. These soils can grow food. Even Iowa State, not the bastion of progressive thinking when it comes to agriculture, says that we can feed 200 people per acre per year in Iowa all the fruits and vegetables they need for the USDA minimum daily requirement. 200. You know how many we're feeding right now? We're feeding 37, the amount of pork they eat in a year. The amount of pork they eat in a year. That's what we're doing. There are great forces that are threatened by this vision. And you know of them, you've heard of them today. Francis explained them. Those forces are well-heeled. They are whispering in our candidates' ears, and we have to know how to raise the volume of our voices, of the people here, and all the incredible, brilliant, and experienced, responsible, environmentally responsible farmers that we heard from today. But if we do nothing soon, in 20 years, it will be Walmart and Amazon deciding what our landscape looks like. Okay, maybe Costco too. All right, and we'll all feel better because there's some organic there. Now, we have a solution. And I skipped over a page. There we go. Today, our solution at the Sustainable Iowa Land Trust is something nobody ever talks about. It's the ownership of land. I think Francis probably owns all or most of his land. I'm pretty sure that George and Patty own all of their land. I know that Mark Shepard over there in Wisconsin owns his land, and that Joel Salatin, the guru of rotational grazing and local food production, inherited his land. And Kim Alexander, an advisor of ours, a libertarian from up in northwest Iowa, inherited his land. And I know that because my dad died and left me a chunk of change, I own 75 acres with my husband on the Cedar River. It must be nice to be landed gentry. But that's exactly who we are. And let's not make any bones about that. We have a certain advantage because we own that land. And I think we have a certain responsibility. And our responsibility is not to sit on that land until it's worth 4 times what it was when we bought it, because that's exactly what it is right now, 4 times what it was 20 years ago. Our responsibility is to grow that soil, like we've heard about today, and grow food for our communities. That's a good thing. It's a skill that I have yet to acquire, but I'm working on it. But our responsibility is to pass it on to the next generation in a way where they can even have a prayer of doing the same thing. So what SILT does is we take the price of land off the market. If people give us their farms, we give lifetime leases to the young people who want to farm it, or the new Americans, or the new farmers of any stripe, African Americans. They can lease the land forever, but the land has become a common good. And they lease it at a pretty severe discount because we're requiring truly sustainable, as you would call it, regenerative practices. And they get to own the house and the barns and the business. They own the infrastructure on top. They have the pride of ownership, they have the equity, and when they're done, we will pay them back for those buildings. And that is how we can afford to get the next generation on the land. And we demand clean farming that will heal the planet and store carbon and save our soil and clean our rivers, and food that our people can eat right here in America, so that when our kids go to the store right after school, walking home, like I see them every day in West Branch, walking from the school to the Jack and Jill, they'll walk out with something other than Cheetos and nachos, because that's what they're walking out with right now. And 123 acres per county in Iowa, we could feed every man, woman, and child who lives here. And instead, we're importing 90% of our food. Right now, there are almost no federal laws that encourage this kind of farming or this kind of farm protection. Get this, $35 million in the Farm Bill this year to permanently protect farmland for the entire country. In 5 years, SILT has protected $3 million worth of land in Iowa on 9 farms. So that gives you some idea how petty that number is and how useless. But we could actually pay farmers the amount of value they would lose by restricting their property to farmland. And it would be permanent. It wouldn't be every year going back to the taxpayers for money. It wouldn't be every new administration coming back and hoping we have enough pull to get something in the Farm Bill. A one-time payment for the amount that they lose by restricting the use of their land to just farming, no more housing developers, and we would have that investment surrounding every one of our communities in Iowa and around the country for good, for the future, and it would be affordable now to all the future generations as far as we can see from here. In Vermont, they do that. In Vermont, the people of Vermont have voted to spend their public dollars to pay farmers for that difference because they know how important in a little tiny state like Vermont that farmland is. Here in Iowa, people are actually donating their entire farms and donating that 40–45% value sometimes to put those deed restrictions on. They are donating it. All they get is some tax deduction at the federal level if they're lucky, or a tax credit at the state level. It is not enough, but that's what our values are. And last year, our legislators tried to take even a little tax credit away from those landowners who are giving their land to the public good. Those are our values right now. Let's take targeted farmland off the market for food production around our communities. Let farmers reduce their greatest but most invisible expense, the price they pay to the bank. So our solution, and I'm just going to end here, our solution: offer uniform voluntary protection of farmland across the country so that future generations of farmers can afford to get on the land. Require developers operating under federal contracts to offset the land they pave over with farmland protection funds. They're going to make good money off of developing that land. Let them pay some of it over to protecting land. Create a vision to rebuild the local food system with climate-friendly agriculture. Let's not forget about everyone between the farmer and the consumer. All the procurement and distribution and everything else, the food safety folks. We need to rebuild that whole system, and we cannot put it all on the millennials like we do here in Iowa right now. And eliminate the step-up in basis. You farmers know what I'm talking about, and you'll probably shoot me for it. The step-up in basis drives up the cost of land by building in the escalating value of land without tax consequences. The step-up means that the value of your land can quadruple or even more, but the day you die, it's reset at zero, and your kids get to pretend there were no capital gains when they sold that land. The day after you die, they can sell that land and pay no capital gains, even if you've been sitting on it for 50 years. Okay? That's the step up. And it is building in land speculation into Iowa and the whole country's price of farming, the cost of farming. And Francis and George, I'm totally with you. Let's deal with price. The price of land is where we should start, because it's the bankers and the financiers who are making all of that money off of that mortgage interest and taking it, sucking it out of this country. And if we could reduce that price of land, we could reduce everything else that you need to make a living. And let's create a President's Advisory Council on Regenerative Agriculture to inform agriculture and environmental policy. And let's stop pitting farmers against environmentalists. This room knows that there is no difference when you do it right. And let's teach our policymakers that there are all kinds of farmers, because I'm a little tired, like I said, of this whole thing about ag versus food. So there's more than just the ones they see in the TV ads, standing by their big machine, you know, God made a farmer and all that. And that respecting more of them would do the world a whole lot of good. Thank you very much.